Part 3 of A Child of the Jago by Arthur Morrison. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Sections 13 to 16. Section 13. 10 days after his first tour of the old Jago, the Reverend Henry Sturt first preached in the parish church made of a stable, in an alley behind Meakin Street, but few yards away, though beyond sight and sound of the Jago. There, that Sunday morning was a morning of importance, a time of excitement, for the fight between Billy Leary and Josh Perrott was to come off in Jago Court. The assurance that there was money in the thing was a sovereign liniment for Billy Leary's bruises, for they were but bruises, and he hastened to come by that money, lest it melt by caprice of the backers, or the backers themselves fall at unlucky odds with the police. He made little of Josh Perrott, his hardness and known fighting power notwithstanding, for was there not full a stone and a half between their weights, and had not Billy not 4 or 5 inches the better in height, and a commensurate advantage in reach, and Billy Leary's own hardness and fighting power were well proved enough. It was past 11 o'clock. The weekly rents, for the week forthcoming, had been extracted, or partly extracted, or scuffled over. Old Poll Rann, who had made money in 65 years of stall farming and iniquity, had made the rounds of the 6 houses she rented, to turn out the tenants of the night who were disposed to linger. Many had already stripped themselves to their rags at pitch and toss in Jago Court, and the game still went busily on in the crowded area and in overflow groups in Old Jago Street, and men found themselves deprived, not merely of the money for that day's food and that night's lodging, but even of the last few pence set by to back a horse for Tuesday's race. A little regarded fight or two went on here and there as usual, and on curbs and doorsteps sat women, hideous at all ages, filling the air with the rhetoric of the Jago. Presently down from Edge Lane and the posties came the high mobsmen, swaggering in check suits and billycocks, gold chains and lumpy rings, stared at, envied, and here and there pointed out by name or exploit. "Him has done the spark in from Regent Street for 9 centuries of quids. Him has done 5 stretch for a snide bank bill and they never found the oof. Him has maced the bookies in France and shot the nark in the boat," and so forth. And the high mob being come, the fight was due. Of course a fight, merely as a fight, was no great matter of interest, the thing was too common. But there was money on this, and again, it was no common thing to find Billy Leary defied, still less to find him challenged. Moreover, the thing had a Rann and Leary complexion, and it arose out of the battle of less than a fortnight back. So that Josh Perrott did not lack for partisans, though not a Rann believed he could stand long before Billy Leary. Billy's cause, too, had lost some popularity, because it had been reported that Sally Green, in hospital, had talked of summonsing Norah Walsh in the matter of her mangled face, a scandalous device to overreach, a piece of foul practice repugnant to all proper feeling, more especially as such a distinguished Jago as Sally Green, so well able to take care of herself. But all this was nothing as affecting the odds. They ruled at 3 to 1 on Billy Leary, with few takers, and went to 4 to 1 before the fight began. Josh Perrott had been strictly sober for a full week, and the family had lived better, for he had brought meat home each day. Now he sat indifferently at the window of his room, and looked out at the crowd in Jago Court till such time as he might be wanted. He had not been out of the room that morning. He was saving his energy for Billy Leary. As for Dicky, he had scarce slept for excitement. For days he had enjoyed consideration among his fellows on account of this fight. Now he shook and quivered, and nothing relieved his agitation but violent exertion. So he rushed downstairs 100 times to see if the high mob were coming, and back to report that they were not. At last he saw their overbearing checks and tore upstairs, face before knees, with "Here they are, father! Here they are! They're coming down the street, father!" and danced frenzied about the room and the landing. Presently Jerry Gullen and Kiddo Cook came, as seconds, to take Josh out, and then Dicky quieted a little externally, though he was bursting at the chest and throat, and his chin jolted his teeth together uncontrollably. Josh dragged off his spotted coat and waistcoat and flung them on the bed, and then was helped out of his ill-mended blue shirt. He gave a hitch to his trousers band, tightened his belt, and was ready. "Ta-ta, old girl," he said to his wife with a grin. "Back again soon." "With a bob or two for ye," added Kiddo Cook, grinning likewise. Hannah Perrott sat, pale and wistful, with the baby on her knees. Through the morning she had sat so, wretched and helpless, sometimes putting her face in her hands, sometimes breaking out hopelessly, "Don't, Josh, don't! Good God, Josh, I wish you wouldn't!" Or, "Josh, Josh, I wish I was dead!" Josh had fought before, it was true, and more than once, but then she had learnt of the matter afterward. This preparation and long waiting were another thing. Once she had even exclaimed that she would go with him, though she meant nothing. Now, as Josh went out the door, she bent over Louis and hid her face again. "Good luck, father," called Dicky. "Going—" though the words would hardly pass his throat, and he struggled to believe that he had no fear for his father. No sooner was the door shut than he rushed to the window, though Josh would not appear in Jago Court for 3 or 4 minutes yet. The sash line was broken, and the window had been propped open with a stick. In his excitement Dicky dislodged the stick, and the sash came down on his head, but he scarce felt the blow, and readjusted the stick with trembling hands, regardless of the bruise rising under his hair. "Ain't you going to look, mother?" he asked. "Want you hold up Louis?" But his mother would not look. As for Louis, she looked at nothing. She had been taken to the dispensary once again, and now lay drowsy and dull, with little more movement than a general shudder and a twitching of the face at long intervals. The little face itself was thinner and older than ever, horribly flea-bitten still, but bloodlessly pale. Mrs. Perrott had begun to think Louis was ailing for something, though it might be measles or whooping cough coming, and complained that children were a continual worry. Dicky hung head and shoulders out of the window, clinging to the broken sill and scraping feverishly at the wall with his toes. Jago Court was fuller than ever. The tossing went on, though now with more haste, that most might be made of the remaining time. A scuffle still persisted in one corner. Some stood to gaze at the high mob, who, to the number of 8 or 10, stood in an exalted group over against the back fences of New Jago Street. But the thickest knot was about Cocko Harnwell's doorstep, whereon sat Billy Leary, his head just visible through the press about him, waiting to keep his appointment. Then a close group appeared at the archway, and pushed into the crowd, which made way at its touch. The disturbed tossers pocketing their coppers, but the others busily persisting, with no more than a glance aside between the spins. Josh Perrott's cropped head and bare shoulders marked the centre of the group, and as it came, another group moved out from Cocko Harnwell's doorstep, with Billy Leary's tall bulk shining pink and hairy in its midst. "He's in the court, mother," called Dicky, scraping faster with his toes. The high mobsmen moved up toward the middle of the court, and some from the two groups spread and pushed back the crowd. Still 6 couples, remote by the walls, tossed and tossed faster than ever, moving this way and that as the crowd pressed. Now there was an irregular space of bare cobblestones and house refuse, 5 or 6 yards across, in the middle of Jago Court, and all round it the shouting crowd was packed tight, those at the back standing on sills and hanging to fences. Every window was a clump of heads, and women yelled savagely or cheerily down and across. The two groups were merged in the press at each side of the space, Billy Leary and Josh Perrott in front of each, with his seconds. "Now then, any more till they begin?" bawled a high mobsman, turning about among his fellows. 3 to 1 on the big 'un. 3 to 1. Here, I'll give 4s. 4 to 1 on Leary. 4 to 1. 4 to 1. But they shook their heads. They would wait a little. Leary and Perrott stepped out. The last of the tossers stuffed away his coppers, and sought for a hold on the fence. "They're a-sparring, mother," cried Dicky, pale and staring, elbows and legs a-work, till he was like to pitch out of the window. From his mother there but jerked a whimpering sob, which he did not hear. The sparring was not long. There was little of subtlety in the milling of the Jago, mostly no more than a rough application of the main hits and guards, with much rushing and roughening. What there was of condition in the two men was Josh's. Smaller and shorter, he had a certain hard brownness of hide that Leary, in his heavy opulence of flesh, lacked, and there was a horny quality in his face and hands that reminded the company of his boast of invulnerability to anything milder than steel. Also his breadth of chest was great. Nevertheless, all odds seemed against him, by reason of Billy Leary's size, reach, and fighting record. The men rushed together, and Josh was forced back by weight. Leary's great fists, left and right, shot into his face with smacking reports, but left no mark on the leathery skin, and Josh, fighting for the body, drove his knuckles into the other's ribs with a force that jerked a thick grunt from Billy's lips at each blow. There was a roar of shouts. "Go it, father! Father! Father!" Dicky screamed from the window, till his voice broke in his throat, and he coughed himself livid. The men were at holds, and swaying this way and that over the uneven stones. Blood ran copiously from Billy Leary's nose over his mouth and chin, and as they turned, Dicky saw his father spit away a tooth over Leary's shoulder. They clipped and hauled to and fro, each striving to break the other's foothold. Then Perrott stumbled at a hole, lost his feet, and went down with Leary on top. Cheers and yells rent the air as each man was taken to his own side by his seconds. Dicky let go the sill and turned to his mother, wild of eye, breathless with broken chatter. "Father hit him on the nose, mother, like that. His ribs is going black where father pasted 'em. He was out of breath fust. There's blood all over his face, mother. Father would have chucked him over if he hadn't tumbled in a hole. Father hit him twice on the jaw. Oh!" Dicky was back again on the sill, kicking and shouting, for time was called, and the two men rushed together in a tangled knot. But the close strife was short. Josh had but closed to spoil his man's wind, and leaving his head to take care of itself, stayed until he had driven left and right of the mark, and then got back. Leary came after him gasping and blowing already, and Josh feinted a lead and avoided, bringing Leary round on his heel and off again in chase. Once more Josh met him, drove at his ribs and got away out of reach. Leary's wind was going fast, and his partisans howled savagely at Josh, perceiving his tactics, taunting him with running away, daring him to stand and fight. "I'll take that 4-1," called a high mobsman to him who had offered the odds in the beginning. "I'll take a quid on Perrott." "Not with me you won't," the other answered. "Evens if you like." "Right, done at evens, a quid." Perrott, stung at length by the shouts from Leary's corner, turned on Billy and met him at full dash. He was himself puffing by this, though much less than his adversary, and at the cost of a heavy blow, which he took on his forehead, he visited Billy's ribs once more. Both men were grunting and gasping now, and the sound of blows was as of the confused beating of carpets. Dicky, who had been afflicted to heartburst by his father's dodging and running, which he mistook for simple flight, now broke into excited speech once more. "Father's hit him on the jaw again. His eyes bungled up. Go for it, father. Bash him. Father's landing him. Hannah Perrott crept to the window and looked. She saw the foul Jago mob swaying and bellowing about the shifting edge of an open patch, in the midst whereof her husband and Billy Leary, bruised, bloody, and gasping, fought and battered infuriately, and she crept back to the bed and bent her face on Louis's unclean little frock, till a fit of tense shuddering took the child, and the mother looked up again. Without, the round ended. For a full minute the men took and gave knock for knock, and then Leary, wincing from another blow, swung his right desperately on Perrott's ear and knocked him over. Exultant shouts rose from the Leary faction, and the blow struck Dicky's heart still. But Josh was up almost before Kiddo Cook reached him, and Dicky saw a wide grin on his face as he came to his corner. The leathery toughness of the man and the advantage it gave him now grew apparent. He had endured to the full as much and as hard punching as had his foe, even more and harder. Once he had fallen down on the broken cobblestones with all Leary's weight on him, and once he had been knocked down on them. But for the sweat that ran over his face and down his back, and for a missing front tooth and the lip it had cut, He showed little sign of the struggle. While Leary's left eye was a mere slit in a black wen, his nose was a beaten mass which had ensanguined him, and indeed Josh, from crown to waist, and his chest and flanks were a mottle of bruises. "Father's all right, mother. I see him laughing. And he smashed Leary's nose all over his face." Up again they sprang for the next round, Perrott active and daring, Leary cautious and a trifle stiff. Josh rushed in and struck at the tender ribs once more, took 2 blows callously on the head, and sent his left at the nose with a smack as of a flail on water. With that Leary rushed like a bull, and Josh was driven and battered back, for the moment without response. But he ducked and slipped away, and came again, fresh and vicious. And now it was seen that Perrott's toughness of hand was lasting. Leary's knuckles were raw, cut and flayed, and took little good by the shock they met the other's stubborn muzzle, while Josh still flung in his corniest fists, hard and lasting as a bag of bullets. But suddenly, stooping to reach the mark once more, Josh's foot turned on a projecting stone, and he floundered forward into Billy's arms. Like a flash, his neck was clipped in the big man's left arm. Josh Perrott was in chancery. Quick and hard, Leary pounded the imprisoned head, while Jerry Gullen and Kiddo Cook danced, distracted and dismayed, and the crowd whooped and yelled. Dicky hung delirious over the sill, and shrieked he knew not what. He saw his father fighting hard at the back and ribs with both hands, and Leary hammering his face in a way to make pulp of an ordinary mazzard. Then suddenly Josh Perrott's right hand shot up from behind, over Leary's shoulder, and gripped him at the chin. Slowly, with tightened muscles, he forced his man back over his bent knee, Leary clinging and swaying, but impotent to struggle. Then, with an extra wrench from Josh, up came Leary's feet from the ground, higher, higher, till suddenly Josh flung him heavily over, heels up, and dropped on him with all his weight. The Ranns roared again. Josh was up in a moment, sitting on Kiddo Cook's knee, and taking a drink from a bottle. Billy Leary lay like a man fallen from a housetop. His seconds turned him on his back, and dragged him to his corner. There he lay, limp and senseless, and there was a cut at the back of his head. The high mobsman who held the watch waited for half a minute, and then called, "Time!" Josh Perrott stood up, but Billy Leary was knocked out of knowledge, and heard not. He was beaten. Josh Perrott was involved in a howling, dancing crowd, and was pushed, grinning, this way and that, slapped on the back, and offered drinks. In the outskirts the tossers, inveterate, pulled out their pence and resumed their game. Dicky spun about, laughing, flushed and elated, and as soon as the door was distinct to his dazzled sight, he ran off downstairs. His mother, relieved and even pleased, speculated as to what money the thing might bring. She put the baby on the bed and looked from the window. Josh, in the crowd, shouted and beckoned her, pointing and tapping his bare shoulder. He wanted his clothes. She gathered together the shirt, the coat, and the waistcoat, and hurried downstairs. Louis would come to no harm lying on the bed for a few minutes. And indeed, Hannah Perrott felt that she would be a person of distinction in the crowd, and was not sorry to have an excuse for going out. "3 cheers for the missus," sang out Kiddo Cook as she came through the press. "I said he'd have a bob or 2 for you, didn't I?" Josh Perrott indeed was rich, a capitalist of £5, for a sovereign aside had been put up, and his backer had put a sovereign on him at 3 to 1, so that now it became him to stand beer to many sympathisers. Also, he felt that the missus should have some part in the celebration, for was it not her injury that he had avenged on Sally Green's brother? So Hannah Perrott, pleased, though timorous, was hauled away with the rest to Mother Gapp's. Here she sat by Josh's side for an hour. Once or twice she thought of Louis, but with native inertness she let the thought slip. Perhaps Dicky would be back, and at any rate it was hard if she must not take half an hour's relaxation once in a way. At last came Dicky, urgent perplexity in his face, looking in at the door. Josh, minded to be generous all round, felt for a penny. "Mother," said Dicky, plucking at her arm, "Pigeony Poll's at home, nussing Louis. She told me to tell you to come at once." Pigeony Poll? What right had she in the room? The ghost of Hannah Perrott's respectability rose in resentment. She supposed she must go. She arose, mystified, and went, with Dicky at her skirts. Pigeony Poll sat by the window with the baby in her arms and pale misgiving in her dull face. I come here, Mrs. Perrott, mum," she said with a sort of husk in her thick voice. "I come in 'cause I see you going out. I thought the baby be alone. She's had a sort of fit, all stiff and blue in the face and crying her little mouth. She's left off now, but I don't know what to make of her. She's so. Hannah Perrott stared blankly and lifted the child, whose arm dropped and hung. The wizened age had gone from Louie's face, and the lids were down on the strained eyes. Her pale lips lay eased of the old pinching, even parted in a smile, for she looked in the face of the angel that plays with dead children. Hannah Perrott's chin fell. "Law!" she said bemusedly, and sat on the bed. An odd croaking noise broke in jerks from Pigeony Poll as she crept from the room, with her face bowed in the bend of her arm, like a weeping schoolboy. Dicky stared, confounded. Josh came and gazed stupidly, with his mouth open, walking tiptoe, but at a word from Kiddo Cook, who came in his tracks, he snatched the little body and clattered off to the dispensary to knock up the young student. The rumour went in the Jago that Josh Perrott was in double luck, for here was insurance money without a doubt, but in truth that was the thing that the Perrotts had neglected. Hannah Perrott felt a listless relief. Josh felt nothing in particular, except that there was no other thing to be done, and that Mother Gapp's would be a cheerful place to finish the day in and keep up the Mrs. Pecker. So that 8 o'clock that evening at Perrott's witnessed a darkening room wherein an inconsiderable little corpse lay on a bed, while a small ragamuffin spread upon it with outstretched arms, exhausted with sobbing, a soak of muddy tears. "Oh, Louie, Louie, can't you hear? Won't you never come to me no more?" And the Reverend Henry Sturt, walking from church through Luck Row toward his lodging in Kingsland Road, heard shouts and riot behind the grimy panes of Mother Gapp's, and in the midst the roar of many voices joined in the Jago chant. 6 blooming long months in a prison, 6 more blooming months I must stay, for meeting a bloke in our alley, and taking his axter away. Toorally, toorally, looral, toorally, toorally, lay. A cautioning a bloke in our alley, and taking his axter away. Section 14. On an autumn day 4 years after his first coming to the Jago, the Reverend Henry Sturt left a solicitor's office in Cheapside and walked eastward, with something more of hope and triumph in him than he had felt since the Jago fell to his charge. For the ground was bought whereon should be built a church and buildings accessory, and he felt, not that he was like to see any great result from his struggle, but that perhaps he might pursue it better armed and with less of grim despair than had been his portion hitherto. It had taken him 4 years to gather the money for the site, and some of it he was paying from his own pocket. He was unmarried, and had therefore no reason to save. Still he must be careful, for the sake of the parish. The church must be built, and some of the money would probably be wanted for that. Moreover, there were other calls. The benefice brought a trifle less than £6,200 a year, and out of that, as far as it would go, he paid, with some small outside help, £130 for rent of the temporary church and the adjacent rooms, the organist's salary, the rates and the gas bills, the cost of cleaning, care, and repair, the sums needed for such relief as was impossible to be withheld, and 1,000 small things beside. While the Jagos speculated wildly among themselves as to the vast sums he must make by his job. For what toff would come and live in the Jago except for a consideration of solid gain? What other possible motive could there be, indeed? Still, he had an influence among them such as they had never known before. For one thing, they feared in him what they took for a sort of supernatural insight. The mean cunning of the Jago, subtle as it was and baffling to most strangers, foundered miserably before his relentless intelligence. And crafty rogues, wide as Broad Street, as their proverb went, at first sulked, faltered, and prevaricated transparently, but soon gave up all hope or effort to deceive him. Thus he was respected. Once he had made it plain that he was no common milch cow in the matter of gratuities, to be bamboozled for shillings, cajoled for coals, or bullied for blankets, then there became apparent in him qualities of charity and loving kindness, well judged and governed, that awoke in places a regard that was in a way akin to affection, and the familiar habit of the Jago slowly grew to call him Father Sturt. Father Sturt was not to be overreached. That was the axiom gloomily accepted by all in the Jago who lived by what they accounted their wits. You could not juggle shillings and clothing, convertible into shillings, out of Father Sturt by the easy fee-for-fum of repentance and salvation that served with so many. There were many of the Jagos, mightily despised by some of the sturdier ruffians, who sallied forth from time to time into neighbouring regions in pursuit of the profitable sentimentalist, discovering him, black-coated, earnest, green, sometimes a preacher, sometimes a layman, sometimes one having authority on the committee of a charitable institution, dabbling in the East End on his own account, or administering relief for a mission, or dispersing a mansion house fund. He was of two chief kinds, the merely soft, the man of wool as the Jago word went, for whom any tale was good enough, delivered with a proper wistful misery, and the gullible cocksure, confident in a blind experience, who was quite as easy to tap when approached with a becoming circumspection. A rough and ready method, which served well in most cases with both sorts, was a profession of sudden religious awakening. For this one offered an aspect either of serene happiness or of maniacal exultation, according to the customer's tastes. A better way, but one demanding greater subtlety, was the assumption of the part of earnest inquirer, hesitating on the brink of salvation, for the attitude was capable of indefinite prolongation, and was ever productive of the boots, the coats, and the half-crowns used to coax weak brethren into the fold. But with Father Sturt such trouble was worse than useless. It was, indeed, but to invite a humiliating snub. Thus, when Fluffy Pike first came to Father Sturt with the intelligence that he had at last found grace, Father Sturt asked if he had found it in a certain hamper, a hamper hooked that morning from a railway van, and if it were of a quality likely to inspire an act of restoration to the goods office. Nothing was to be done with a man of this disgustingly practical turn of mind, and the Jagos soon ceased from trying. Father Sturt had made more of the stable than the makeshift church he had found. He had organised a club in a stable adjoining, and he lived in the rooms over the shut-up shop. In the club he gathered the men of the Jago indiscriminately, with the sole condition of good behaviour on the premises. And there they smoked, jumped, swung on horizontal bars, boxed, played at cards and bagatelle, free from interference save when interference became necessary. For the women there were sewing rooms and singing, and all governed with an invisible discipline which, being brought to action, was found to be of iron. Now there was ground on which might be built a worthier church, and Father Sturt had in mind a church which should have by its side a cleanly lodging-house, a night shelter, a club, baths and wash-houses, and at a stroke he would establish this habitation and wipe out the blackest spot in the Jago. For the new site comprised the whole of Jago Court and the houses that masked it in Old Jago Street. This was a dream of the future, perhaps of the immediate future, if a certain new millionaire could only be interested in the undertaking, but of the future certainly. The money for the site alone had been hard enough to gather. In the first place, the East London Elevation Mission and Pansophical Institute was asking very diligently for funds, and was getting them. It was to that, indeed, that people turned by habit when minded to invest in the amelioration of the East End. Then, about this time, there had arisen a sudden quacksalver, a panjandrum of philanthropy, a mummer of the market-place, who undertook, for a fixed sum, to abolish poverty and sin together, and many, pleased with the new gaudery, poured out before him the money that had gone to maintain hospitals and to feed proved charities. So that gifts were scarce and hard to come by, indeed were apt to be thought unnecessary, for was not misery to be destroyed out of hand? Moreover, Father Sturt wanted not for enemies among the sentimental cocksure. He was callous and cynical in the face of the succulent penitence of Fluffy Pike and his kind. He preferred the frank rogue before the calculating snivelmonger. He had a club at which boxing was allowed, and dominoes, flat ungodliness. He shook hands familiarly every day with the lowest characters, his tastes were vulgar and brutal, and the company at his club was really dreadful. These things the cocksure said with shaking of heads, and these they took care should be known among such as might give Father Sturt money. Father Sturt! The name itself was sheer papistry, and many comforted themselves by writing him anonymous letters, displaying hell before his eyes, and dealing him vivid damnation. So Father Sturt tramped back to the Jago, and to the strain and struggle that ceased not for a moment of his life, though it never left a mark of success behind it. For the Jago was much as ever. Were the lump once leavened by the advent of any denizen a little less base than the rest, were a native once ridiculed and persuaded into a spell of work and clean living, then must Father Sturt hasten to drive him from the Jago ere its influence suck him under for ever, leaving for his own community none but the entirely vicious. And among these he spent his life, preaching little in the common sense, for these were but idle vanity in this place, but working, alleviating, growing into the Jago life, flinging scorn and ridicule on evil things, grateful for tiny negative successes, for keeping a few from ill behaviour but for an hour, conscious that wherever he was not, iniquity flourished unreproved, and oppressed by the remembrance that albeit the Jago death rate ruled full 4 times that of all London beyond, still the Jago rats bred and bred their kind unhindered, multiplying apace and infecting the world. In Luck Row he came on Josh Perrott, making for home with something under the skirt of his coat. "How do you do, Josh?" said Father Sturt, clapping a hand on Josh's shoulder and offering it as Josh turned about. Josh, with a shifting of the object under his coat, hastened to tap his cap peak with his forefinger before shaking hands. He grinned broadly, and looked this way and that, with mingled gratification and embarrassment, as was the Jago way in such circumstances. Because one could never tell whether Father Sturt would exchange a mere friendly sentence or two, or, with concealed knowledge, put some disastrous question about a watch, or a purse, or a breastpin, or what not. "Very well, thanks, Father," answered Josh, and grinned amiably at the wall beyond the vicar's elbow. "And what have you been doing just lately?" "Oh, odd jobs, Father." Always the same answer, all over the Jago. "Not quite such odd jobs as usual, I hope, Josh, eh?" Father Sturt smiled, and twitched Josh playfully by the buttonhole, as one might treat a child. "I once heard of a very odd job in Kingsland Road that got a fine young man 6 months' holiday, eh, Josh?" Josh Perrott wriggled and grinned sheepishly, tried to frown, failed, and grinned again. He had only been out a few weeks from that 6 months. Presently he said, "All right, Father. You do rub it into a bloke. No mistake." The grin persisted as he looked first at the wall, then at the pavement, then down the street, but never in the parson's face. "Ah, there's a deal of good in a blister sometimes, isn't there, Josh? What's that I see? A clock? Not another odd job, eh?" It was indeed a small nickel-plated American clock which Josh had under his coat, and which he now partly uncovered with positive process. "No, s'help me, Father, it's out straight, all fair trade. Father, just a swap for something else, on me solemn Davy, that's what it is. Father, straight." "Well, I'm glad you thought to get it, Josh," Father Sturt pursued, still twitching the buttonhole. "You never have been a punctual churchgoer, you know, Josh, and I'm glad you made arrangements to improve. You'll have no excuse now, you know, and I shall expect you on Sunday morning. Promptly. Don't forget, I shall be looking for you." And Father Sturt shook hands again and passed on, leaving Josh Perrott still grinning dubiously and striving to assimilate the invitation to church. The clock was indeed an exchange, though not altogether an innocent one, the facts being these. Early that morning Josh had found himself scrambling hastily along a turning out of Brick Lane. accompanied by a parcel of 9 or 10 pounds of tobacco, and extremely conscious of the hasty scrambling of several other people round the corner. Some of these people turned that corner before Josh reached the next, so that his course was observed, and it became politic to get rid of his parcel before a possible heading off in Meakin Street. There was one place where this might be done, and this was at Weech's. A muddy yard, one of a tangle of such places behind Meakin Street, abutted on Weech's back fence, and it was no uncommon thing for a Jago on the crook, hard pressed, to pitch his plunder over the fence, double out into the crowd, and call on Mr. Owen Weech for the purchase money as soon as opportunity served. The manoeuvre was a simple one, facilitated by the plan of the courts, but it was only adopted in extreme cases, because Mr. Aaron Weech was at best but a mean paymaster, and with so much of the upper hand in the bargain as these circumstances conferred, was apt to be meaner than ever. But this case seemed to call for the stratagem, and Josh made for the muddy yard, dropped the parcel over the fence, with a loud whistle, and backed off by the side passage in the regular way. When he called on Mr. Aaron Weech a few hours later, that talented tradesman, with liberal gestures, told out shillings singly in his hand, pausing after each as though that were the last. But Josh held his hand persistently open, till Mr. Weech, having released the 5th shilling, stopped altogether, scandalised at such rapacity. But still Josh was not satisfied, and as he was not quite so easy a customer to manage as the boys who commonly fetched at the shop, Mr. Weech compromised, in the end, by throwing in a cheap clock. It had been in hand for a long time, and Josh was fain to take it, since he could get no more. And thus it was that Dicky, coming in at about 5 o'clock, was astonished to see on the mantelpiece, amid the greasy ruins of many candle ends, the clock that had belonged to the Ropers 4 years before. Section 15. As for Dicky, he went to school. That is to say, he turned up, now and again, at irregular intervals, at the board school just over the Jago border in Honey Lane. When anything was given away, he attended as a matter of course. But he went now and again without such inducement, perhaps because he fancied an afternoon's change, perhaps because the weather was cold and the school was warm. He was classed as a half-timer, an arrangement which variegated the register but otherwise did not matter. Other boys, half-timers or not, attended as little as he. It was long since the managers had realised the futility of attempting compulsion in the Jago. Dicky was no fool, and he had picked up some sort of reading and writing as he went along. Moreover, he had grown an expert thief, and had taken 6 strokes of a birch rod by order of a magistrate. As yet he rarely attempted a pocket, being, for most opportunities, too small, but he was comforted by the reflection that probably he would never get really tall, and thus grow out of pocket-picking when he was fully experienced, as was the fate of some. For no tall man can be a successful pickpocket, for he must bend to his work, and so advertise it to every beholder. Meanwhile Dicky practised that petty larceny which is possible in every street in London, and at odd times he would play the scout among the practitioners of the "fats-a-running" industry. If one crossed Meakin Street by way of Luck Row and kept his way among the courts ahead, he presently reached the main Bethnal Green Road, at the end whereof stood the great goods depot of a railway company. Here carts and vans went to and fro all day, laden with goods from the depot, and certain gangs among the Jagos preyed on these continually. A quick-witted scout stood on the lookout for such vehicles as went with unguarded tailboards. At the approach of one such he sent the shout, "Fats a runnin'," up Luck Row, and quick at the signal a gang scuttled down, by the court or passage which his waved hand might hint at, seized whatever could be snatched from the cart, and melted away into the courts, sometimes leaving a few hands behind to hinder and misdirect pursuit. Taking one capture with another, the thing paid very well, and besides there were many vans laden with parcels of tobacco, not from the railway depot, but from the tobacco factories hard by, a click from which was apt to prove especially lucrative. Dicky was not a notable success as scout. The department was a fairly safe one, but it was not always easy to extract from the gang the few coppers that were regarded as sufficient share for service done. Moreover, Mr Weech was not pleased, for by now Dicky was near to being his most remunerative client, and the cart robberies counted nothing, for the Fat's running boys fenced their swag with the publican at Hoxton. And though Dicky had grown out of his childish belief that Mr Weech could hear a mile away and see through a wall, he had a cautious dread of the weapon he supposed to be ever to his patron's hand: betrayal to the police. In other respects things were easier. His father took no heed of what he did, and even his mother had so far accepted destiny as to ask if he had a copper or two when there was a scarcity. Indeed, Hannah Perrott filled her place in the Jago better than of old. She would gossip, she drew no very rigid line as to her acquaintance, and Dicky had seen her drunk. Still, for old Jago Street she was a quiet woman, and she never brawled nor fought. Of fighting, indeed, Josh could do enough for the whole family, once again 4 in number; for the place of Louis, forgotten, was supplied by M, aged 2. When Dicky came home and recognised the clock on the mantelpiece, being the more certain because his mother told him it had come from Weech's, the thing irritated him strangely. Through all those 4 years since he had carried that clock to Mr Weech, he had never got rid of the wretched hunchback. He too went to the board school in Honey Lane. It lay between Dove Lane and the Jago. But he went regularly, worked hard, and was a favourite with teachers. So far Dicky was unconcerned. But scarce an ill chance came to him but, sooner or later, he found the hunchback at the back of it. If ever a teacher mysteriously found out that it was Dicky who had drawn his portrait, all nose and teeth, on the blackboard, the tale had come from Bobby Roper. Whenever Dicky, chancing upon school by ill luck on an afternoon when sums were to be done, essayed to copy answers from his neighbour's slate, up shot the hunchback's hand in an instant, the tale was told, and banders were Dicky's portion. Once, dinnerless and hungry, he had stolen a sandwich from a teacher's desk, and though he had thought himself alone and unseen, the hunchback knew it, and pointed him out, white malice in his thin face, and eager hate in his thrust finger. For a fortnight Dicky dared not pass a little fruit shop in Meakin Street because of an attempt on an orange, betrayed by his misshapen schoolfellow, which brought him a hard chase from the fruiterer and a bad bruise on the spine from a board flung after him. The hunchback's whole energies, even his whole time, seemed to be devoted to watching him. Dicky, on his part, received no injuries meekly. In the beginning he had tried threats and public jeers at his enemy's infirmity. Then, on some especially exasperating occasion, he pounded Bobby Roper savagely about the head and capsized him into a mud-heap. But bodily reprisal, though he erected it into practice, proved no deterrent. For the little hunchback, though he might cry at the pummelling, retorted with worse revenge of his own sort. And once or twice, bystanders, seeing a deformed child thus treated, interfered with clouts on Dicky's ears. The victim, moreover, designed another retaliation. He would go to some bigger boy with a tale that Dicky had spoken vauntingly of fighting him and beating him hollow with one hand. This brought the big boy after Dicky at once, with a hiding, except on some rare occasion when the hunchback rated his instrument of revenge too high, and Dicky was able to beat him in truth. But this was a very uncommon mistake, and after this Dicky did not wait for specific provocation. He clumped Bobby Roper or rolled him in the gutter as a matter of principle whenever he could get hold of him. That afternoon Dicky had suffered again. 2 days earlier tea and cake had been provided by a benevolent manager for all who attended the school. Consequently the attendance was excellent, and included Dicky. But his attempt to secrete a pocketful of cake to carry home for M was reported by Bobby Roper, and Dicky was hauled forth, deprived of his plunder and expelled in disgrace. He waited outside and paid off the score fiercely by the help of a very long and pliant cabbage stalk. But this afternoon Bill Bates, a boy a head taller than himself and 2 years older, had fallen on him suddenly in Lincoln Street, and though Dicky fought desperately and kicked with much effect, had dealt him a thrashing that left him bruised, bleeding, dusty, and crying with rage and pain. This was the hunchback's doing, without a doubt. Dicky limped home, but was somewhat comforted by an accident in Shoreditch High Street, whereby Costa's barrow-load of cough-drops was knocked over by a covered van, and the cough-drops were scattered in the mud. For while the carman and the coster flew at each other's name and address, and defamed each other's eyes and mother, Dicky gathered a handful of cough-drops, muddy, it is true, but easy to wipe, and so he made for home more cheerfully disposed, till the sight of the roper's old clock brought the hunchback to mind once more, and in bitter anger he resolved to search for him forthwith, and pass on the afternoon's hiding with interest. As he emerged into the street, a hand was reached to catch him, which he dodged by instinct. He rushed back upstairs and emptied his pockets, stowing away in a safe corner the rest of the cough-drops, the broken ruin he called his knife, some buttons and pieces of string, a bit of chalk, 3 little pieces of slate pencil, and 2 marbles. Then he went down again into the street, confident in his destitution, and watched, forgetting the hunchback in the excitement of the spectacle. The loafers from the corners had conceived a sudden notion of co-operation, and had joined forces to the array of 20 or 30. Confident in their numbers, they swept the street, stopping every passenger, man, woman, or child, and emptying all pockets. A straggler on the outskirts of the crowd, a hobbledehoy like most of the rest, had snatched at, but had lost Dicky, and was now busy, with 4 or 5 others, rolling a woman, a struggling heap of old clothes and skinny limbs, in the road. It was Biddy Flynn, too old and worn for anything but honest work, who sold oranges and nuts from a basket, and who had been caught on her way out for her evening's trade in High Street. She was a fortunate capture, being a lone woman with all her possessions about her. Under her skirt, and tied round her waist with string, she kept her money-bag. It was soon found and dragged away, yielding 2 and 8pence farthing, and a lucky shoe-tip, worn round and bright. She had, moreover, an old brass brooch, but unfortunately her wedding ring, worn to pin-wire, could not be got past the knotted knuckle, though it would have been worth little in any case. So Biddy Flynn, exhausted with plunging and screaming, was left, and her empty basket was flung at her. She staggered away, wailing and rolling her head, with her hand to the wall, and the gang, sharing out, sucked oranges with relish, and turned to fresh exploits. Dicky watched from the Jago Court passage. Business slackened for a little while, and the loafers were contemplating a raid in force on Mother Gap's till, when a grown lad ran in pell-mell from Luck Row with a square parcel clipped under his arm, a parcel of aspect well known among the fat Runnings boys, a parcel that meant tobacco. He was collared at once. "Stow it, Bill, oi!" he cried breathlessly, recognising his captor. "The blokes are coming." But 6 hands were on his plunder, and was snatched away, and he was flung back on the flags. There was a clatter on the stones of Luck Row, and a light van came rattling into Old Jago Street, the horse galloping, the carman lashing and shouting, "Stop him! Stop thief!" The sight was so novel that for a moment the gang merely stared and grinned. This man must be a greenhorn, new to the neighbourhood, to venture a load of goods up Luck Row. And it was tobacco, too. He was pale and flustered, and he called wildly, as he looked this way and that, "A man stole something off my van. Where's he gone?" "No good, governor," cried one. "The ball's stopped rolling. You've lost him." "My God!" said the man in a sweat. "I'm done. There's 2 quid's worth of bucker, and I only got the job on Monday. Been out 9 months." "Was it a parcel like this here?" asked another, chuckling and lifting a second packet over the tailboard. "Yes, yes. Put it down. God, what you up to? Here, help, help." The gang were all over the van, guffawing and flinging out the load. The carman yelled aloud, and fought desperately with his whip. Bill Hanks is near blind of an eye now from one cut, but he was the worse for it, for he was knocked off his van in a heap, and as he lay they cleared his pockets and pulled off his boots, and those that had caught the sting of his whip kicking him about the head till it but shifted into slime at the stroke, an inanimate lump. There was talk of how to deal with the horse and van. To try to sell them was too large a job and too risky, so, as it was growing dusk, the senseless carman was put on the floor of the van, the tailboard was raised, and one of the gang led the horse away, to lose the whole thing in the busy streets. Here was a big hall, and many of the crowd busied themselves in getting it out of sight, and scouting out among the fences to arrange sales. Those who remained grew less active and hung at the corner of Luck Row little more than an ordinary corner group of loafers. Then Dicky remembered the Hunchback and slouched off to Dove Lane. But he could see nothing of Bobby Roper. The Jago and Dove Lane were districts ever at feud, active or smouldering, save for brief intervals of ostentatious reconciliation serving to render the next attack on Dove Lane the more savage, for invariably the Jagos were aggressors and victors. Dicky was careful in his lurkings, therefore, lest he should be recognised and set upon by more Dove Lane boys than would be convenient. He knew where the Ropers lived, and he went and hung about the door. Once he fancied he could hear a disjointed tinkle, as of a music box grown infirm, but he was not sure of it, and in the end he contented himself, for the present, with flinging a stone through the Ropers' window and taking to his heels. The Jago was black with night, the rats came and went, and the cosh-carriers lurked on landings. On a step, Pigeony Poll, drunk because of a little gin and no food, sang hideously and wept. The loafers had dispersed to spend their afternoon's makings. The group which Dicky had left by Luck Row Corner, indeed, had been discouraged early in the evening in consequence of an attempt at turning over old Beveridge, as he unsuspectingly stalked among them in from his city round, for the old man whipped out his case-knife, and drove it into the flesh of Nobber Sug's arm, at the shoulder, stabbed at another two and ripped his coat. So Nobber Sug, with blood streaming through his sleeve, went off with two more to tie up the arm, and old Beveridge, grinning and mumbling fiercely, strode about the street, knife in hand, for 10 minutes, ere he grew calm enough to go his way. This Tommy Rann told Dicky, sitting in the backyard and smoking a pipe charged with tobacco pillaged from a tin-full which his father had bought, at about 4p. a pound, from a loafer. And both boys crawled indoors, deadly sick. Section 16. Josh Perrott was at church on Sunday morning, as Father Sturt had bid him. Not because of the bidding, but because the vicar overtook him and Kiddo Cook in Meakin Street and hauled them in, professing to be much gratified at their punctuality and charging them never to fall away from the habit. The two Jagos, with dubious grins, submitted as they must, and were in a little while surprised to find others arriving, friends and acquaintances never suspected of church-going. The fact was that Father Sturt, by dint of long effort, had so often brought so many to his stable church, as he had now brought Josh and Kiddo, that the terrors and embarrassments of the place had worn off, and many, finding nothing more attractive elsewhere, would make occasional attendances of their own motion. Wet Sundays particularly inclined them to church, where there might be a fire, where at least there was a clean room with pictures on the wall, where there were often flowers, where there was always music, and where Father Sturt made an address of a quarter of an hour, which no one ever suspected of being a sermon, an address which one might doze over or listen to, as one might be disposed, but which most listened to, more or less, partly because of an uneasy feeling that Father Sturt would know if they did not, and partly because it was very easy to understand, was not oppressively minatory, was spoken with an intimate knowledge of themselves, and was, indeed, something of a refreshing novelty, being the simple talk of a gentleman. Josh Perrott and Kiddo Cook were not altogether sorry they had come. It was a rest. Stable though it had been, they had never sat in so pleasant a room before. There was nothing to do, no constant watch to be kept, no police to avoid, and their wits had a holiday. They forgot things. Their courage never rose so high as to build the thought, but in truth pipes would have made them happy. The address being done, Father Sturt announced the purchase of the site for the new church, and briefly described his scheme. He would give the tenants good notice, he said, before the houses were destroyed. Meantime they must pay rent, though most of the amounts would be reduced. And after the benediction, Father Sturt, from his window over the closed shop, saw Josh Perrott and Kiddo Cook guffawing and elbowing one another up Luck Row. Each was accusing the other of having tried to sing. End of Part 3